Hello, I'm Jim Linnell, and you know what I get to do today? I get to do some leather work, and I am pretty tickled about that. I'm here at Springfield Leather today, and I'm going to do a pattern that shows you a little bit about Sheridan style carving, but we're going to do it with a particular heart motif. In fact, it's one that came out of a pattern pack that I did, which is this one here. I did a whole group of patterns with a heart as the theme. In fact, this is the one that we're going to do. It's got a little bit of a Sheridan type of a look to it, but there's some others in here that are really involved. This one here is like totally built up with like acanthus leaves and stuff like that. It's just got a whole lot of three-dimensional interaction with it. It's a fun one to do. Here's one that is done with just a swivel knife. But again, that heart motif. These are really great patterns. If you wanted to like make a wedding registry or something like that, these are great. Or a Bible cover. There's just a whole lot of neat things you could do with these. They're all of the size where you could do that with them. There's really involved ones with some ribbon and stuff like that. But anyway, if you ever get a chance, and roses, yeah, everybody loves roses. If you ever get a chance to pick this up, I think you'll find a lot of things there that will challenge your leatherwork and maybe help take you to another level with your leatherworking skills. So, but as I mentioned, we're going to today do a pattern that is out of there. It's in fact, here's the one that I finished. It's got a Sheridan type of a motif to it. It's got a lot of the Sheridan characteristics with it, and it'll allow me to teach you a little bit about how that style of leatherwork is done. And I just happen to have a nice new piece of Herman oak leather here for me to do this on, and I think it's ready to roll. So with that, what do we do first? Well, we got to get our leather ready, right? Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we have to case it. And that's what this wetting down process is called. When we dampen the leather down like this, though, it's sometimes confusing about how much moisture should you put on it. Some of the instruction books out there say, get your leather wet and then go ahead and go to work on it. But, you know, there's more to it than that. What's the right amount? Well, the right amount is to have your leather moist so that it gets wet about halfway through that piece of leather. This piece of leather I'm working with here is probably about a 6-7 ounce, something like that. So, and that's why I'm using a sponge and water to put it on. I don't use a spray bottle very often because, well, I want that water or that moisture to penetrate at least halfway through that piece of leather. So I'll go over it a couple of times here just to make sure there's plenty of moisture in it. As I work on it, I'll have to dampen it again. It isn't going to stay wet forever. So, and that's one of the things you have to kind of be aware of is maintain that moisture in your leather. Doesn't mean it stays looking wet like this, but we do need to have that moisture down in the middle fibers of that piece of leather. That's how we get the best results out of it when we are doing our stamping and our cutting and all of that. So that's step one, getting your leather cased. And then we got to get a pattern on there. And you know what I did? I actually have this already traced onto some tracing paper. Well, actually, I cheated. I took it and ran that through some my printer, and I made a photocopy on some tracing material, and it works really good. I just use a laser printer. So I'm going to center this up. And one of the things that's really important with any design you're ever going to do is you really need to make sure that you you have good focus all the way through it. I'm about to start here, and so first thing I want to do is make sure I get this traced on there really well. And once I start tracing, I don't want something to move on me here so that I get kind of off kilter. So I'm going to take a little piece of tape here, and I'm going to tape this down so that nothing moves once I start doing the tracing. It can be kind of hard to reline things back up again. So. And I'm just basically got it centered up here so that it's in the middle of my piece of leather. I'm not really making anything out of this, so we'll tape it down here in a couple of spots. And then we'll get it traced on. So I use a stylus that I've actually modified it a little bit. This is Old Faithful, the one I use all the time. You can tell how dirty it is. But one end of it is quite fine. In fact, it's got a really small tapered point on it, and it's been polished on the end. I actually take my stylus and my modeling tool, actually all of my tools, I keep them polished up. But this one here, after I got this to a real fine point, I actually took it on my strop like I would my swivel knife and polished up the end of it. Why would I do that? Well, that's so that I can, when I run it over the paper here, it's not going to tear through it. It just kind of glides over the top of it. So, and yes, you got to be able to see what you're doing. So I get my extra set of eyes on here so I can see. And we'll just go ahead and get this traced on. So accuracy is important, like I said. So right now, I'm laying down the groundwork, that the roadmap that I'm going to have to follow with my swivel knife, my beveler, and all the other steps that are going to come after this. So how well I do this tracing on step here really kind of lays out how well I'm going to do with the whole pattern. And that's kind of an important thing to remember. The time to get serious, the time to get focused in is right now, right at the very beginning of your project. And just put a little bit of pressure on it. If you're tearing through your paper or whatever you're using, you're probably bearing down way too hard. And it really doesn't take that much for you to get a nice imprint on there. In fact, we'll get a couple more lines on here, and then we'll check and just make sure that we're getting what we need here. And as I mentioned, this pattern is along the lines of a Sheridan style pattern, although it's one that I drew, and I borrowed mostly the Sheridan style techniques in the drawing of it, but there's a few things I borrowed from a guy by the name of Shirley Brown. Probably you've never heard of that name, and it was a guy. He was a saddle maker down in Texas, and he's the one that utilized this kind of a little bud here for the starting point for a lot of his patterns. That's one of the things typically about Sheridan style patterns. They'll usually kind of run in circles. It's a bunch of circles connected together, which the heart and all of that, kind of works well for that. But where do they begin? A lot of times they just circle back on themselves. Here, see, double checking here just to make sure I have a good pattern tracing. You can see it's showing up really nice there, so I'll just continue on with that. When you tape it down like that, it allows me to check and then go back and lay it back down, and everything's still lined up. But anyway, it's a fun pattern to do. There's a few things that I get to show you, though, about the Sheridan's type stuff that isn't part of the way a lot of normal leather work is done, so it makes a great pattern for us. One of the things I learned a long time ago is that if you are tracing something like this, sometimes it can be easy to misalign. And so that's one of the other reasons I have it all taped down like this, so that, before I rip everything off of here, and I can stop and double check, make sure I've got all those lines traced, because, like I said, relining all this back up again can be a little bit difficult. So this is step one, and this is where accuracy becomes important. One of the great things about leatherwork today that I think maybe is probably underappreciated is that we don't have to learn how to be an artist first and how to draw our own patterns and things like that. The world is full of a lot of great patterns, and it's real easy for you to get some really good patterns that will teach the basics to you, how to use the tools and how a pattern ought to look and everything. Yeah, you'll eventually maybe want to get to where you can draw your own patterns, but that's not the first thing you have to learn. And sometimes I'll have folks tell me that they can't do leatherwork because, well, I'm just not an artist. I can't do that. Well, good. You don't have to be. You just have to want to do leatherwork. All right, looks like we're almost done here, but you know what I'm going to do before I just like rip this off? I'm going to double check again, make sure I got all the lines traced on there. And it looks like I did this time. Yep, I did this time. You can see that, this small, why do I have a small stylus? This has got a very rounded point on it. It's kind of like you know what a harness needle is? It's kind of like that. They're dull, but they come to a fairly fine point. That's kind of what the tip of this is like. And the reason for that is sometimes this pattern here is not all that super detailed, but sometimes when we get into some of these finer patterns, some of these lines come so close together, and if you're using a stylus that's got like a big fat ball on the end of it, it can be really difficult for you to get all of that detail traced onto your pattern. So that's why I like to use something that's got a pretty fine tip. Again, just be careful you don't tear through it all the way. So anyway, so what's next? Well, we got to get that cut into the leather. So let's get Old Faithful out here. I call it Old Faithful because I've been using this knife for probably, and this blade for probably 40 years. And so before you start asking all those questions about the blade, let me explain it to you. But even before that, what do you got to do before you start cutting? Well, you got to make sure your knife is working well, right? And so I've got a strop here. My strop is just is a piece of probably 2-ounce leather that's been stuck down to a board, and it's got jeweler's rouge rubbed onto it. Jeweler's rouge is the same stuff that a jeweler would use to put on the buffing wheels to polish up jewelry and things like that. And that's exactly what it does to a swivel knife blade. It puts a very high polish on it. And when you're using a blade like I have here, this one is actually a ceramic blade. There's nothing magical about it, but it still needs stropping. It doesn't get dull so much. I mean, the edge doesn't round off or anything like that, but it still needs polishing. And I'll explain that in a minute. But when you have like a metal blade, the traditional type blade like this, that actually helps to put a higher polish on it. It actually shines it up some more. Why do we strop a blade? Well, again, for that reason. We want like almost a mirror-like finish on this cutting surface so that when we draw it through the leather, it's not sticking and dragging and kind of jumping along like that. It makes it that much harder for us to be able to use this knife. And what kind of blade is the perfect one to use? Whichever one you have. Believe it or not, you can use whatever you have. It will do this kind of carving just fine. I use this blade here for everything that I do. Figure carving, small detailed stuff. I even sign my name with it, believe it or not. It does all of that. But it's not because it's some magical blade or anything like that. In fact, it's thicker than what most people use today. You know what makes this blade so special is the hand that runs it. This hand right here, if you knew how long and how many times this hand right here had run a swivel knife, you would know why. Well, it's not the blade, it's how much practice I've had. And you might hear me mention that more than once as we go through this, that you know what it takes to get good at this? You got to do leather work. You got to practice. You got to hone those skills. It isn't something that's automatic. It does take a little bit of trial and error sometimes, and that was, by the way, the name of my most famous teacher, trial and error. I've messed up probably more leather than a lot of people will ever use. So anyway, back to this tool here. If you've never done leather work before, this is the most awkward looking thing you can imagine. How do you hold it? What I tell folks when they're starting out is, lay it on your granite and then just pick it up. And you know what? That right there is pretty close to the grip you're going to use. It's a fingertip controlled tool. So what I use I actually let my forefinger rest into the yoke up to about the first knuckle here. Sometimes it'll get just past that. But it rests out there toward the end of that finger. And then my thumb rests on one side, my middle finger just opposite of that. My ring finger actually rests against the side of the blade, and then as I'm making the cuts, I actually let the side of my whole side of my hand, my wrist and everything rest on the table. So I got great balance. This thing is not going to like run off in some direction out of my control. It's going to go exactly where I want it to go. And you know what? It's a swivel knife. This top up here spins. It doesn't have to spin. It just has to be able to be fluid like that so that it moves. And why does it do that? Well, a lot of times, especially in the Sheridan style of leather work, we have a lot of curving lines, like right here at the beginning of this little bud here where the whole pattern begins. There's a lot of these running these wavy looking lines, and I don't do that by twisting the leather underneath my tool or anything like that. As I come around the base of this, it's a big round flowing cut, and so as I'm cutting, I'll stop right there and I'll turn it so that my knife is always being pulled toward me. I'm always making the cuts by drawing it toward me. And when you're using a straight blade like I am, that means you have to angle the knife away from you, tip the top of it away from you so that it's the cutting blade that's actually doing the cutting. So it's just the corner of the blade that's in the leather. And that's why a lot of people like to use an angle blade. That way they can hold it straight up and down, and that angle helps them. Is that what you have to have? No, use whatever you have. I know some saddle makers that use blades that are like 1/2 inch wide and just big old honking things like that. And you know what? They do beautiful work with it. But you know why? It's because they probably used that for 40 years. You know, they've used that same thing. It's an extension of their hand. They aren't switching to a different blade every time they want to do some other kind of work. And that's not what I do either. This one does everything that I want to do. I mentioned to you that we have to keep them stropped up. And so what I mean by that is every time you pick it up, strop it. You can never have a swivel knife blade that is too smooth, that's working too well, that runs through the leather too nicely. It don't happen. But I do know people that just get into cutting mode, and they just, eventually it starts to drag and it gets harder and harder and harder, and they never go back and strop it. So do strop it often. And even a ceramic blade needs stropping. And the reason for that is, well, in the tanning process, one of the last things they do in there is they'll actually hand rub some fat liquors and oils into the leather. That's what gives our leather a nice burnish, that dark color that comes out when we have the moisture and everything just right. But that same stuff that is in there that gives us that great carbon quality will actually build up on my blade. And so when I strop my ceramic blade, what I'm doing is I'm actually cleaning it. I'm actually cleaning off that stuff that's building up on that blade. And so they all need it. So don't think you've got some kind of a blade that never needs any kind of maintenance. Again, I've been at this a long time. I think this year makes 55 years since I got my beginner set of tools. And you know what? The hardest tool for me to learn to use was the swivel knife. I didn't know about rouge. I didn't know about a strop or any of that kind of stuff. I would had it sharp, and I would just learn how to get like a death grip on this thing so it would go wherever I wanted it to go, and I could manage it all right. And one day I was at the Miles City Saddlery, and I was watching one of these old saddle makers. He was carving some leather, and I was just a young kid then, so he didn't mind me looking over his shoulder. And every once in a while he had this strop hanging off, or this piece of leather hanging off of his bench, and he'd pick it up and he'd take his knife and work it back and forth on there. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, you got to strop your knife." And I said, "What is strop your knife?" And he said, "Well, if you don't, it ain't going to stay working smooth." And I said, he explained to me what it was and gave me a little piece of rouge. And so I started using it, and I said, "Oh my God." All of a sudden this got so much easier to do. Part of it is having a good piece of leather. Obviously, having a piece of leather like you would get from Herman Oak is certainly going to make that knife work a little bit better. But knowing how to keep that knife maintained is really important, and it does take practice. One of the things that challenges, I guess, that leather workers have, especially when you have a design like this where you got lots of big looping curves and stuff like that, it's real easy to do what's called undercutting. You know what that is? That's when when I'm cutting here, I'm pulling the knife straight toward me. Okay, so if I'm sitting straight back behind my hand here and I'm pulling the knife straight toward me, well, my hand's in the way. So there's two things you can do. But what some people do is they'll just lean their hand over like that. That way I can see what the blade's doing, right? But you know what that does? It causes the blade to slice under the surface of the leather. That's what we call undercutting. And you can see that. It'll usually raise up a little wrinkle on one side of the line, and it makes it so that you, those lines become very difficult to bevel later on, and it'll also gradually distort your design. You want to follow these lines as closely and as carefully as you can. If you didn't trace them well, you're already in a little bit of trouble. So make sure that you start with the tracing, and then when it comes to the cutting, make sure you're cutting right on the lines that you trace so that you get that nice fluid curves there so that you have this a graceful flow to your design. That's kind of an important thing. How deep do you think I'm cutting? Well, this is 6/7 ounce leather, so I can cut this pretty deep, but what is the actual depth you should have in your cutting when you're cutting a design into the leather? What I use as a guide is I try to cut about 1/3 the thickness. You know, not all leather is all the same thickness. When I am working on, like a wallet for somebody, it's going to be a lot lighter than this. It's going to be about half as thick as this. This is 6/7 ounce. Usually wallet backs I'll work with maybe a 2-3 ounce piece of leather. Well, if I bear down on that and cut as deep as I am right now, that'd be way too deep on that piece of leather. So, but 1/3 the thickness is a good guide. When you're working on then things like belts or saddles or that kind of saddle skirting, man, you don't even have to worry about am I going too deep. In fact, you have to really work hard to go deep enough. One of my earlier opportunities to do a lot of leather carving, there was a saddle maker in my hometown that he made a great saddle. He was well known for the quality of saddles that he made. They rode really well, but you know what? He hated to carve leather. Now, he might put like some basket weave on it or something like that, and he might put a little flower on it, but he just hated it. And so whenever he got an order for a full carved saddle or something like that, he would either talk him out of it or he'd job it out to me. And so I got the opportunity to carve a lot of really heavy leather. And one of the things that he was adamant about, he said, I don't care what the design is. He said, that's not important. He said, well, I just want it carved deep. Everything's got to be deep, cut it deep, bevel it deep. I want a deep pattern on there. Well, I learned how to get a lot of depth out of my leather work. And but I also learned later on then when I started doing stuff on a lot lighter weight that, you can't go like as full tilt all the way. Sometimes you got to learn how to back off. So learning how to control your knife to make it cut cleanly and get the depth that you want is really an important thing. On a design like this, where we've got all of this nice flowing curves and such like that, having nice flowing curves is really important. And I think on this design, there's some scrolls, these big looping things, and I'll show you how we stamp those out and everything. But boy, they got to be cut really cleanly to make sure that those curves are like round. Sometimes I'll see folks cut these with a whole bunch of straight lines put really close together, and so you got like these square corners on it. That's not what you want to do. When I'm cutting a scroll, you can see I'm not trying to cut this all in one long sweeping cut. I'm doing this in a whole series of cuts because I want to be able to see where I'm going. I want to make sure that my knife is right on that line. But when I get to the point where I can't see where I'm going anymore with my knife, then I'll stop it. I'll take my knife away. I'll turn the leather so that I can once again see where I'm at. But then I don't start right where I left off. I'll start like about 1/8 of an inch back up the cut that I was just making, and then as I pull my knife, it's already starting to follow that same curve. And it makes it real easy for me to make a nice continuous flow on those curving lines and makes it doable. There are people out there, I've heard their students come to me and say, the guy that told me how to run a swivel knife said that once you start a cut, you got to make that whole cut without ever picking up your knife. You know what my reaction is? I said, well, that's just stupid. I mean, why would you do that? Why would you make it harder to do that? It doesn't make your leatherwork better. I mean, what kind of a stupid rule is that you can't pick up your knife? I mean, the whole goal is the results you produce, not the technique you follow. It's the results that you produce. That's what's most important. When you get all done with any piece of leatherwork and you give it to the person that ordered it, or, you give it away to somebody that's special, whatever, the first thing they're going to say is, golly, I wonder, did you pick up your knife in the middle of that cut or not? That's just stupid. I mean, what's really important is that people, that you produce a really nice, clean design. And that's what people are going to judge your work by, is how well you did with your leather work. The finished results is your piece of advertisement. So, as you can tell, I get kind of upset when people get fed the wrong information. Leatherwork is fun. There's a reason I've been at this for 50-some years. And it isn't because I find it just really a lot of hard work. I mean, look at this. This is fun. I mean, and when I get done, I got some really cool stuff to look at. I hope you will do it long enough to have some success so that you will know what that feels like. Leatherwork is just a blast. And you know what? When you make something, when you invest your time, you invest your talent and your abilities into creating something for someone, you're giving them a piece of you. You're giving them some of your time that you invested, that you decided to give to someone. And you know what? That's what makes this special. This is kind of some neat stuff. And oh my gosh, the history and the heritage we have in leatherworking. I mean, this goes back to like the earliest days of our country. Can you imagine when the settlers come over here? They had to manage the critters, and they had to manage their lives, and some of the most important people in their society were the leatherworkers. They're the ones that kept their gear in good working order. They're the ones that gave them the equipment to manage the cattle and the horses and such. And where would we be without the leatherworkers? We wouldn't have. They were important. I guess that's what I'm saying. Anyway, and I guess I say that because I'm a leather worker. I've been at it a long time and really do enjoy it. So I'm cutting about 1/3 the thickness. A lot of these lines, and it's kind of hard to show here, but a lot of these lines, like over here where you have the edge of this line just kind of ends out here in the middle of the stem over here. When I get to those places like that, I'm lightening up. I'm letting my cuts fade out. Yes, I'm cutting 1/3 the thickness of the leather, pretty much all the way around this curve, but as I draw it down here toward where that cut is going to end, I gradually fade it out and let that cut disappear. And why would I do that? Well, part of that is, or the biggest reason, is because that adds to the flow of your design. It really gives a nice, graceful flow. If we come up to a line like that, and then we stop with the cut just as deep as where we started, it's like an abrupt halt at the end of it. When I see a design like that where someone has done that, it just interrupts the whole flow of the design. It makes it difficult for my eye to glide through it and appreciate the whole thing. When you do a floral design like this, I want people's eyes to just kind of gracefully follow all these lines around. I want them to follow it. And when you have cuts that come to an abrupt halt like that, they just come to an ending like that, your eye does too. You lose the grace and the flow and the beauty that you've been putting into this piece of leather. So pay attention to little things like that. One of the videos that I've done is probably one of my more popular videos, which I have lots of videos over at elktrackstudio.com. But one of the more popular ones that I have over there is one called Beyond the Basics. When I did that video, the whole reason for that was these little things like I'm explaining about tapering out the cuts and all of that, those are little things that don't ever get explained. If you go look at the instruction books and such like that, they don't ever get into these little details. There are things, I never got to meet Al Stolman. I did receive the Al Stolman Award, but I never got to meet him. In fact, another story, Ann Stolman was still alive. She actually hung that award around my neck. It was a pretty awesome moment. I got lots of stories about that. But I never got to meet him. And if I could have, though, one of the things I would have asked him, because I look at his stuff was, the pictures that I looked at and tried to figure out how does he do that? And I would see the tools that he used, and I'd try to use the tools the same way it looked like he was using them, but my results were quite a bit different than what he was getting. And so I would have loved to ask him, okay, so what's the little stuff you're doing? How are you finishing these things? There are things that, well, just like I'm trying to explain to you here, there's things that are not in the books. There's things that they don't explain in there. And I would love to have cornered him and asked him those kind of questions. So that's when I teach a class like this or do a video or wherever. I'm always trying to make sure I fully explain what I'm doing, why I do it, and so forth. When I have live students in my classes, the most important thing that they should be doing is asking me why. Why do you do it that way? Why is that important? Because my goal is not to impress you all with how great a leather worker I am. My goal is to make you a leather worker. My goal is for you to understand how to do this so that you can think through a project and be able to do leather work. So anyway, hey, look, with all that talking, I got this all cut. So what's next? Well, we need to add some texture. We need to add some contour. We've got a nice design here. I mean, it definitely looks like a heart now. But there's leaves and petals and stuff like that, and they need to have some 3-dimension and some contour in them. And so what do we do that with? Well, let's use pear shaders. Now, in the world of Sheridan style leatherwork, they use what's called thumbprints. What's a thumbprint and what's a pear shader? A thumbprint, I don't even know if I brought one with me, but thumbprints are basically long, skinny pear shading tools, and the ones that they make for Sheridan style carving tend to be flat. They don't have really much of any doming. They'll have textures if that's what they want, but they tend to be straight. They tend to be long and straight, and the way they use them is with tipping them up so that the one end makes a deeper impression than the other. They angle them a little bit, and that's how they get things to fade out. You know what? I don't like them. So, and here's truth in advertising. You're learning how to do leatherwork and Sheridan style carving the way Jim Linnell does it. So, but I'll try to explain to you why I do it the way I do it too. So, all right. So with pear shading, what do we have? Well, we got some petals. Let's start here with these really large ones that are down at the bottom of this. Well, it's kind of a flower. Where this whole pattern begins, it kind of erupts out of the middle of this cup here in the middle, but there's some long petals underneath that, and so they need some shading. They need some contour in them. In fact, they're so long and skinny, they probably need a couple different things with it. And I'm going to use a pear shader. This is one, in fact, I think, well, not everything, but a lot of these that I'm going to use are Crafto. This is a P368. I'm pretty sure it's still around. It's kind of an old faithful. It's the long and skinny one, and it works pretty well for what I'm doing here. So why am I using this instead of a thumbprint? It's because a thumbprint, I can walk these, okay? These tools are made not to just make a single impression, but they're made to be able to flow along and add to the contour of your design. Pear shading, for example, the shading that goes into the petals of a flower should follow the contour and the flow of the flower. And if you look real carefully here, where's my something to point with? Here's something to point with. If you'll notice the way I did this, I stayed a nice even distance away from the edge of this petal. And I started out pretty deep up here at the top, but as my tool went down the length of it toward the base, it got lighter and lighter and lighter. In fact, it faded out. You can't tell where I actually ended. But it follows the flow. It follows the contour of that petal. In fact, I'm going to do the same thing down this other side and maybe leave a little raised ridge there in the middle, that would be a great place to put some decorative cuts. So I'm going to start again up here at the top. And the reason I can walk this tool and create the effect that I'm creating is because of how these tools are made. These craft tools were, or these older tools like this, were the results of leather workers over the years developing tools that did the job they wanted them to do. Okay, they would do. They didn't have a Springfield Leather to go buy tools at, or wherever, they couldn't go to Amazon and order something. They had to, if they didn't have a tool that did what they wanted to do, they had to make one that worked. And things like pear shaders and bevelers and veiners and the tools that we have today are the evolution of what those guys created. These were made the way they are on purpose. And so how are they made? These are domed. They are domed both directions. They are domed from the long end to the pointy end, and they're domed the other way as well. And for that reason, I can walk them along. I can get these nice, long, flowing cuts. It looks like I had one great big shader that did this. I can do that, and I can make the shading follow any sort of contour that I want, even in a flower or wherever, without any problem. And that's one of the things that's difficult with the thumbprints. The thumbprints, if it's something that has to follow around the flow of a curve, it's really hard to make those thumbprints go around the corner because they're just not made to do that. They work really great. Those tools were designed for doing that type of leather work almost in a production mode. They can go around and stamp all of the shading or the thumbprinting in a flower, just go bam, 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 and get it done. I don't do leatherwork that way. I do leatherwork, well, my goal is to do the best leatherwork I can with everything I do, especially, of course, when I'm teaching a class. I mean, golly, this better look good, or you're going to wonder, hey, does this guy even know what he's talking about? So I'm going to try to show you the right way to do it. And as I warned you earlier, you're learning Sheridan style carving the way Jim Linnell does it. So pear shaders too come in lots of sizes. I think when people are out there adding to their tools, everybody starts out usually with the same basic set. They have a shader and a beveler and a camouflage and all those. And I think as you add to your tool collection, you should add more sizes of the same tools you already have. So for example, I've got here, I think this is what I brought with. I've got 4 different pear shaders here. They all have vertical lines on them, and you know what? I can interchange them. I have one that will fit every petal that I'm going to do here without any problem at all, and it makes it real easy to have consistency then in the textures that I'm using. And why do I use textured tools? Well, one of my finishes, in fact, something that they use an awful lot in your Sheridan style of leather carving, is that they will use a resist technique, which basically means they use antique. Antiques are a way to help bring out the detail of a design and such. Heavy, thick stuff that you put on, and it'll collect down into the depressions and into all your cuts and so forth. But it wipes clean then off of the raised areas. And when you have textured tools like I'm using, these lined pear shaders, when you use tools like this, those little lines that are left behind help to gather a little bit more of that color. And so you get a little more 3-dimension brought out of your leather as a result of that. So that's one of the reasons. When I get to the beveling, I'm going to be using some checkered bevelers for that same reason. But I have a step in between there that I want to show you, so stay tuned. So one of the challenges that when I teach basic leatherworking to folks is one of the challenges folks have is figuring out how to walk this tool. Pear shading and beveling for some folks is just the toughest tools to learn to use. And part of it is that they don't learn the technique, or maybe they don't understand what they're doing. First of all, you got to understand, what am I trying to do? Before I start whacking on any of these tools to create any kind of marks on my leather, I kind of got to know what it's supposed to look like when I'm done. And so in those pattern packs, you'll always have like this, a picture of the finished thing. So I could always refer to this, but since I did it, I kind of know what I want to do. But you got to figure out what it is you're making. Okay, so for example, here's a petal. This is one of those long leaves that they use to fill space in Sheridan style carving. And they have shading in the middle of them. But what does that mean? I mean, what are you trying to do? Well, they're not flat petals. They're cupped. You're kind of creating like a little bowl here. You're going to have like the deepest place out in the middle, and then it's going to fade out as you go. And a lot of people struggle with that. I think when I first started using a pear shader tool, and I watched somebody use it, they just went bap, bap, bap like this, and it looked really simple. You just do that and run it along, and it comes out nice and smooth. And when I tried it, it looked like somebody took a ball-peen hammer to my leather, or it looked like it got caught in a hailstorm. I mean, you could see every ding in the leather. There was no nice, smooth, fluid lines or anything like that, and it didn't make sense. But here's what you should be getting. You should be getting something that creates depth and contour and to that, so that you've got the shape starting to happen. And if you look, again, a lot of this is habit. That's why it's good when I have a live class and a live audience. It's good when people say, well, they notice that I do things. And it's like the keeping a consistent distance away from the cuts. You want to be in control of this tool, and to get it to walk like I am, that all comes down to the grip. How I'm holding this tool is what allows me to make it do what I want it to do. Here again, another one of those long, a curving petal, and the shading needs to follow that contour as it comes around there. That's just really an important part of learning to use it. So how do you do that? How do you walk this and get that nice smooth work without having a bunch of bumps in between? Well, it comes with the way I hold it. When I hold these tools, I'm holding them so that my grip is down toward the working end of it. I have my grip down here where the tool is doing the work, so that I have great control over that. I actually have the side of the tool, or the side of my ring finger, resting against the side of the tool, and it's both on the leather and on the tool, so that, it helps guide it. The tool's not going to make some impression somewhere that I don't want it to be. And I've got, we're working here in a studio kind of setting, so I've got great light, but that's also important. You got to have good lighting wherever you're at, be able to see what your tools are doing and so forth. But then when you move this tool along, the walking process that I'm doing here, if I were to, I will. Let me find a bigger leaf to show you. But when I'm doing this, you're watching somebody with like 50 years of practice at this, okay? So it should look pretty easy when I do it. So when I'm doing one of these bigger leaves like this, I want to slow down and show you what's really going on. I'm starting out with a lot of force. Right here's the deepest place where I wanted impression, up here toward the top. But then as I move this tool along and I'm walking it, what you see me doing is I'm holding this with a tight enough grip so that, and it's just barely touching the leather. In fact, I don't know what camera you got me on here. Yeah, that one right there that I'm looking at up there. If I were to hold this above the leather like this, and this is not how I do it, but you could see that because of the tight grip, it acts like a jackhammer. It bounces back up off the leather. Okay? So what I'm doing when I'm walking this tool, I'm holding it so it's just barely touching the leather, sitting right on top of the leather. But with that tight grip, when I hit it, it's not sitting in the hole that I just made. It's sitting back on top of the leather, so that as I walk it along, it's ready to move to the next location. So when I'm working on one of these leaves, and you see me going bam, bam, bam like that, this is like 50 years of practice, okay? But what's really going on is, if you'll look at how far this tool moves each time I hit it, I'm overlapping that tool probably 2/3 or more of the size of that tool. There's no way there's going to be a bump in between each one of those marks. There's no way that I'm going to leave this all choppy and everything. So, and And again, as you move down the length of the leaf, look at how all of this is adding to the flow of this leaf. The shading here, I got the cutting giving this nice flow, and the shading is drawing your eye. Everything is making your eye follow the flow of this design. That's what your shading should do. If your shading is looking like you're just beating the snot out of your leather, quit doing it like that. That's not the way to do it. You're adding contour. You're adding shape and flow to your design here. So keep your eye focused on what you're trying to accomplish. So y'all probably can't tell. I actually enjoy doing leatherwork. I really do. It's kind of fun stuff.
So you're using rawhide
mallet. Yeah.
Instead of a maul.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's probably one of the other things that you'd notice. A lot of the Sheridan guys like to use those mauls, and I don't have one. I mean, I have some. I don't use them, obviously. I use this one here. This one is, I don't even know how old this one is. In fact, I should have brought the other one that's in my shop. I've got one of these that I've sliced like a 1/4 of an inch off each end because I've mushroomed out this end because I've used it so much. But why do I use rawhide? The reason I use rawhide is, well, part of it is because that's what I've always used. And the reason I don't use a maul is I'm not coordinated enough. You know, with a maul, you got this rounded thing, and it works different. And mauls are used differently. You balance them like this, and you do your tapping by rocking your wrist like that. And like I said, I'm just not coordinated enough to do that. So, and I don't need to. The maul isn't what's doing the work. Me knowing what to do with these tools and knowing where to use them and all that is still the most important thing. So what tool you use to strike it with isn't going to be what determines your success as a leather worker. Use what works for you. I don't use the ones with the poly heads. I've tried those a little bit. Obviously, they're a lot more durable than rawhide. They tend to last a lot longer. But the thing I don't like about them is they give me a little chatter. And by that I mean when I hit the tool, sometimes they'll recoil off the tool, and especially like when I'm doing some of this work, and you can get a ghost impression if you're not careful, and that's just, I don't know. Actually, probably the bottom line answer to your question is I'm old and I don't learn new things very well. You know, that's probably the real reason. But anyway.
Well, that's kind of a question that we get every now and then. It's like, what's the best one? Do I need a maul? Do I need a mallet? Does it need to be poly? Does it need to be rawhide? And I think you said it earlier. Man, start with what tools you have.
Yeah, I use what works. The very first mallet I had that when I started out was my beginner's kit came with a wooden one, and I beat that to sawdust. I promise you, it was what I had. It was really lightweight, so I was like way out here at the very end of the handle like this, and getting as much leverage as I could when I whacked it, and that's how I got started. You know, then when that one finally wore out, I decided I'm going to get me a rawhide one like all the big guys use, you know. And in fact, if you ever have a chance up in Sheridan, they have Al Stolman's shop is set up in the museum that they have there. And if you go upstairs there, his mallet is actually there on display. And rumor has it, well, more than rumor, I know folks that worked with him, and they said that Al had his mallet and Ann had hers, and they did not trade off. In fact, he would get totally upset if somebody else used his, because he had a dent kind of off-center up toward the top edge of it, and that's where he hit his tools all the time. Hers was different than that, and when somebody else used his mallet, they ruined it. They created an impression that was different. So anyway, that was his. I've got some more shading I want to do here, and I'm going to switch to another texture before I do that. Let's see, I missed something here. Where was I? Try to be consistent here. Make sure I did the same thing on both sides of this. This pattern is kind of a mirror image. You know, both sides are kind of the reverse of the other, but the scrolls that we have here are different. That's one of the identifying things of a Sheridan style. The scrolls in some leatherworking are very tight. They come around and make almost like a ball at the end of them, and that's kind of a classic type of a scroll, and it's used in other styles. But in the Sheridan style stuff, they have these more open-ended. They're still tight turns and so forth, and they're still treated with a veinner around the outside edge and everything, but they don't come to that tight ball, and so but they still need some shading on them. And the pear shader that I'm going to use for that is, here it is, has got horizontal lines on it. It's again a little small one. 974 is the number on this one. Again, I when I'm doing leatherwork, I could care less about what the number says on the tool or even who made it. That's not important. What is important is what you do on the leather with that tool. You know, that still comes down to you got to learn how to make do and use the tools that you have to create the effects that you want. If you don't have one that does the horizontal lines like this, I like to use the horizontal lines on a scroll just so that because it's got that tight turn, and this tends to add to the flow a little bit. But even with those, they still fade out. You know, we have some shading around the inside of that scroll, and what I try to do, and again, I'll just point out something that I'm doing. This is one of the things that, you know, they don't explain, but you'll notice when I'm using this, when I did the shading on these larger leaves like this, yes, I tried to stay a nice, even, consistent distance away from the edge. And I'm doing the same thing here on the scroll, but I'm trying to keep a consistent distance away from the outside edge of that. All right, so I start up here at the top, at the very end of it. That's where my deepest part is, and I'm paying attention to how far away from this outside line that I am. And as obviously as I get closer or down here to where the scroll tapers down, that means I'm getting closer and closer to the inside edge. And so when I get up here where I'm starting to encroach on that, then I fade it out. And you know what? I did that on purpose. I did that on purpose because that's going to help me actually put the veins in that scroll, and I'll explain that when we get to the veinner step. But that's actually all done on purpose. So that's what I'm doing. You notice I've got this turned so that I can keep an eye on how far away from that outside edge I am. I want to have a nice even consistency there, and then as I get around here where I'm now on the inside edge, then I faded it out. So that's how that's done. So with this step, with this last pear shading here, we'll have the shading done here. And you know what? I haven't used a thumbprint once. And you know what? It'd be really hard to make a thumbprint go around a nice curving leaf like this and walk it like that. But this does the same thing. I mean, I still get the depth at the beginning of where the shading begins, and I get that to fade out to nothing. And I'm in control of the curve. I can make that follow the contour of this scroll or the leaf or whatever. That's why I prefer to use pear shaders rather than thumbprints. I can do any style of leatherwork. It so makes me nuts when I hear people say, "Oh yeah, you can't do that Sheridan stuff unless you go buy official Sheridan style tools because you got to have Sheridan tools to do Sheridan leatherwork, right?" Bull. What you need is knowledge. You need to do enough leatherwork so you know you can do whatever you want to do with the tools that you have. And that doesn't matter what style you're doing. So, all right, I think I'm done with my pear shading. Look at that. Now, I got some color. Look at how nice color that where I use those tools that turn nice and dark. What's that? Well, that's burnish. This piece of leather doesn't look wet anymore, does it? In fact, here's what it looked like when I first wet it down. That's wet, right? But I've been doing all this work, and it's almost back to its original color. Well, this leather actually is just about right at the moment as far as moisture content. The surface doesn't have to look wet. The moisture is down in the inner fibers of this piece of leather, and as I compress the fibers of the leather, those fat liquors and oils I was telling you about early on, those are being brought to the surface. That's what's giving this rich burnish. But having moisture down in the inner parts of this piece of leather is what brings that to the surface. So moisture content is so important. I'm going to continue on here with some beveling and doing some of these other steps, but it doesn't need more water yet. In fact, you can still see it's a little bit damp over here, but I wanted to show you the contrast of how much it's dried out. It really has dried out quite a bit. All right, another tool that they use, and again, this is not what I normally use, but I want to show you how they're used anyway. They use undershots or undercut bevelers, and there's, I don't know, I brought several different ones with me here just to show you kind of how they can look. These are, well, this is an old Hackbarth, and this is one from, I don't know, what, Crafts Plus, I think is who's making these now. Anyway, they have a nice shape to them. You can see they are beveled, but they're almost like a spoon. You know, they come to a very sharp edge down here, but they really are very steep and very angled. And what do? Well, they lift up some places, like here on this cup, this part right here, that is where the vine work all flows out of there. In there we have a scalloped edge here, and what they'll do in places like this is they'll use these undercut tools, and they'll drive them underneath the surface of the leather. Okay, and so you get this undercut. You get it looks like it raised out and such. Now, and they'll do that. And they'll do that at this stage before they bevel, because then when I run with my textured beveler over the top of that, with the checkering, then it cleans that up, because this leaves kind of a divot there. You can see it leaves kind of a polished area behind that, and that polished area doesn't hold any antique when I do that finishing technique. So I'm going to come back over that and bevel that with my regular beveler. So that's why I do it at this stage. Normally, I'm showing you how to use these tools because I'm trying to show you how Sheridan style carving is typically done. And so these are the tools that they use to do it. I don't use these normally. If you go watch another video I recently did on how to do sunflowers, you're going to see that I use pedal lifters to do this kind of work, and I explain in there all the reasons why I think that's a better thing to use. But if you're going to do Sheridan style, you want to be faithful to what that style is. These are the tools that are used to do that. So it's called the undercut bevelers. I guess that's some of the more common names that they're referred to. So that would come at this stage, and then you get on to the regular beveling. So let's get my regular bevelers out here. And yes, they make special bevelers. Well, they say they're special. They are. And I use them. These are some that were made by Barry King, who, if you don't know about the King family, Barry's grandfather was Don King, which everybody gives credit to being the guy that kind of originated the Sheridan style leather carving. But that's another long story. I can tell you all that ins and outs of that too. But these are the bevelers that he makes, and they do have a steeper angle to them. But I was doing this kind of leather work long before I ever had tools like this. In fact, what I used to use, I used the tools that came in my beginner set. They were just regular bevelers. They had a steep angle. They didn't have a steep angle. They were just like regular bevelers. But when I wanted a steep angle, you know what I did? I just leaned my tool forward and changed the angle. I can make a steep angle beveler, or a regular beveler do a steep angle bevel by just leaning it forward like this. Okay, so if that's what you have, and this is the only tools you have, you don't have to, say, all right, I can't do Sheridan because I don't have steep angle bevelers. Forget that. You can do it. Figure out how to use your tools to make them do what you want them to do. I have these, so I'm going to use them. But again, I don't want you to think that you are in any way limited in the leather work you can do by the tools you have. Let me say that again. You are not limited in the amount of leatherwork or the style of leatherwork you can do by the tools you have. You are only limited by your knowledge. And you know where you get that knowledge? You got to do leather work. You got to sit down, use these tools, figure out what you can do with them, figure out how to make them do the things you want them to do. Be innovative. Don't be bound or limited by what you have. You are only limited by your imagination. So, as you can tell, I don't take excuses very well. All right, so I just rebeveled that. So now I've got, this standing out. So what's the point of beveling? The point of beveling is to add the actual 3D to our carving. When we are doing the beveling, we are actually making this design three-dimensional, and that's one of the great things about leatherwork. Not only are we sketching some outline of some intricate floral design onto a piece of leather, we're actually then creating a three-dimensional version of that by the use of these tools. And the beveler is the tool that does that the most. The beveler is a wedge-shaped tool, so if you've never used one before, they're pretty, I guess, pretty easy to understand, but a lot of folks struggle with it. And I think the struggle they have is learning how to make it work, okay? So remember what I was telling you about how you use the pear shader, how you hold it with a pretty tight grip down toward the base of the tool, down toward the end that's actually doing all the work? Well, that's exactly how I use the beveler as well. I'm holding it so that that I have that tight grip, and I'm holding it also so that it's just barely sitting on the leather. It is actually bouncing along on that piece of leather, so that after I hit it, it's not sitting in a hole that I just put in the leather. It's sitting back on top of the leather again, so that I can walk it along and make that next impression. And again, just like with the pear shader, if I were to slow down here and not show off my 50 years of practice, what you would see me doing is moving it only about maybe a fourth of the width of the tool. Look how far that moves. It's not moving very far at all. Most of that impression is overlapping with the last impression I made. So there's no way it's going to end up with some bumps in between. What causes those bumps in between, which is one of the problems a lot of folks have with their beveling, comes out kind of lumpy, is it's caused by moving the tool too far in between each impression. That's one of the things. Or tipping it. I've actually seen people think you got to drive this tool along. They'll use it like a chisel. They'll lean it over like this, and they're trying to whack it along and force it along as they drive it. Well, what you're getting when you do that is you're getting the edge of the tool leaving an impression as much as the face of the tool is. So don't do that. Bad habit. Don't do it. And depth is important here. How deep should you bevel this? Well, here's a rule. Bevel it as deeply as you cut. So what does that mean? Well, 1/3 the thickness for the most part, but remember some of these lines, a lot of these long flowing lines here, I didn't leave them that deep all the way. In fact, it's really important that I don't bevel them the same depth all the way. As I get down to where this line right here ended out in the middle, I got lighter and lighter and lighter with my cutting so that it faded out and disappeared. And you know what? That's what I'm going to do with my beveling. I'm going to bevel to the bottom of the cut. But because the bottom of the cut isn't as deep, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And I don't want you to see where I actually finished. I want it to be a nice, gentle fading out. And if you were here in my presence, you'd be asking, well, why? Why do you do it like that? Well, again, the why is because I want to add to the flow of the design. Look what we've been doing. We've been creating the shading, all kind of draws your eyes around the flow of this thing and pulls your eye toward the middle of this bud right here. And so does the beveling. As the beveling comes around here, look, you come around these curves and such, and your eye just keeps right on flowing with it. If I'd come down here and I'd had this big old divot right where that beveling ended, that's where your eye would have quit following the flow of that design. It would have come to an abrupt halt right there. And so that's the why. It will make your work more graceful, more beautiful. When it's beveling like this too, one of the other things that's really important is bevel on the line. It seems pretty simple, right? But beveling close to that line, or beveling almost on that line, or getting in that general area, that is not good enough. You got to bevel right on that line. That's why, going back to when we started, remember I said accuracy is really important when we trace this design onto the leather. And accuracy was really important when we cut that design into the leather. And so now, bevel exactly where you did it. You've got great lines to follow here. You've got a great pattern. So make sure that you follow those lines. Keep your beveler right on that. One of the things you'll notice here is I'll bevel a little bit, and then I stop and I turn the leather, and then I'll bevel a little more, and then I'll stop and turn. Why do I do that? Well, so I can see what I'm doing. I try to keep the tool, or the line that I'm beveling, between me and the face of that tool. So I'm looking at the face of it. In fact, I think probably you're looking at it from a camera that's set off to my side right here. And so you're actually seeing this. I've got this angled, so you're looking at the face of the tool. All right. If I'm working on this at home, you're not going to see that. I got this turned so that it's facing right straight at me. Okay. So I've got this turned a little bit so you can see what you should be seeing when you're doing beveling there. You should be looking at the face of this tool, making sure that it's exactly down in that cut, and make sure that you're holding, for the most part, straight up and down. Now, with this, especially with these steep angle bevelers, hold it straight up and down. If you have, and by that I mean I'm not leaning it left or leaning it right. I'm holding it straight up and down. If you have the traditional bevelers that most everybody started out with, that means you might, to get, especially where you have closer lines. Actually, this design is not so tight and not so close that you even have to use these steep angle bevelers. I guess I'm using them just to make the point that they do make tools for this, but some of these designs get pretty tight and pretty close together, and that's where that steeper angle helps, because you don't want to have the back end of the tool flattening out some other detail, because you know it mashes down too much leather behind it. So just make sure you're aware of what you're doing here. And yes, you can see here I'm getting nice rich color out of this piece of leather. Look at that burnish. Isn't Hermann Oak awesome stuff? I mean, if you want to do good leather work, use good stuff. I mean, that really kind of goes without saying. And I believe it or not, I spent a lot of time in the leather business. And I've been on both sides of the counter, actually. I've been the guy that sold the leather, and I've been the guy that bought a lot of leather. And one of the things I've learned is that, you know, when I get down, if I'm making like a wallet or a belt or something like that, and I'm looking at leather that might cost $10 a square foot versus leather that's $5 a square foot, well, when you boil that down to the difference in price on a wallet back or a belt or something like that, how much are you really talking about? I mean, you're talking about the difference of $1? Less, maybe, on some. It's not that much when it gets down to the actual thing. But boy, let me tell you, the quality and the results that you get, it's worth that to me to have that difference in the results that I'm producing here. So, don't be stupid. I mean, what is it? Penny wise, pound stupid? I don't know. I've been like that. But I will say this too. About leather in general, is that you got to work with what you got. When I first started out doing leather work, oh my gosh, I guess I'm going to date myself here, but there was no internet. So ordering leather, you know how we did it? We did it with mail order. When I grew up on a ranch that was actually 50 miles from the nearest town. We were probably 200 miles from the nearest place you could buy some stuff like this. So running to town to get me some leather just wasn't an option. Could afford it anyway. So it was mail order. And so you make out your order, you ship it off, and hopefully they'll pick you a really decent piece to work with. But you know what? Whatever you got is what you got. You know, the idea of saying, oh, no, this isn't right. Can you send a pickup tag and let me get a different one? And, you know, you just didn't do that. You had to make do with what you had. And so learning how to use whatever you got is really an important thing. Every piece of leather is workable. You just got to be able to figure out how to do it. One of the stories I heard passed down there was one of the great saddle shops that in the earlier days was over in Arizona, Porter Saddlery, and in fact, they are probably where the originators of the Porter style, that's what it's called, or the Arizona style leather carving came from. In fact, here's a tidbit for you. Did you know that Don King, the guy who's considered the father of all Sheridan style stuff, you know where he got his start? He actually worked at Porter's for a little while. His dad he used to break horses, and they would break horses up in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, places like that during the summer months, and then the winter time they'd head to Arizona, Nevada, even California, and that's where they would work. Well, they were down in Arizona, and Don King, young man, teenager, went into Porter Saddlery and said, I'd like to make some extra money tooling some leather for you. I've done some of it, and they asked him, do you have any tools? And they said, well, no. He said they handed him some nails. They sent him over to work with a guy by the name of Cliff Ketchum, who was another one of the early greats that worked there. He sent him over there, and Cliff said, well, son, do you have any tools? And he said, no. And he said, well, here's some bolts and nails. If you figure out, make you up some tools and such, and I'll show you how to run them. And that's kind of where he got his start. So anyway, if you go up there to Sheridan and look through that museum I was telling you about up there, they have a lot of saddles on display there, and some of the earliest ones from Don King, the father of Sheridan style leather carving. His stuff looks very much like the Arizona style of leatherwork. Anyway, that was a side note there. And what was I going to say? Oh, Porter Saddlery. There's another young guy went into Porter Saddlery. He was I think he grew up, I don't know, like Florida. No, not Florida. But anyway, his name was Bob Dellis. Okay, he was breaking horses in Wyoming or working on a ranch, and that's what he's doing. And anyway, he busted his arm or a leg or something like that. And while he was laid up, he started building some shafts and doing some things like that. And he said, man, this is a lot easier on the body than breaking horses. So he decided he was going to be a leather worker. And so he found out that Porter's was looking for some leather stampers, and he went into Porter's and asked them if they, were looking for some stampers. They said, yeah. And he said, well, I'm what you're looking for. I'm the guy. I can do what you're looking for. He was kind of cocky. And he went in there, and they said, okay, well, let's see what you can do. They handed him, I guess it was some bridles or something, minimal work. But here, go ahead and stamp these up. Let's see what you can do. And he took them home and went back a day or so later and showed them what he had made. And they said, well, do you still have the rest of that leather we gave you? And they said, yeah. And he said, well, could you give it back to us? They weren't all that impressed with what he could do. And so they didn't run him off. They just reassigned him. And so as the story goes, he was the guy then that swept the floors, but one of his jobs was to get leather ready for the real saddle makers there. And back in those days, the real saddle makers, they used what they had. Porters, those are collectible saddles today. Those are the saddles that people pay a lot of money for. And his job was to clean up the leather for him. And leather then used to come in on like box cars. It would be just thrown into box cars. And you'd get it in maybe once every 6 months or whatever. It wasn't like you could call up somewheres and have UPS deliver it. So, and you had to use what you got. And who knows what it looked like. It probably had, footprints on it, and who knows what else was in those cars. But it was his job to clean it up, and that's how it was working. But the point being, all of that to say, you got to be a craftsman. You got to learn how to use what you've got. If that's all you've got, figure out how to make the best piece that you can with it. Every piece of leather, I've never found a piece of leather that can't be tooled. Some can be tooled easier and better than others, but you know what? If that's all you got to figure out how to use it. So be a craftsman. Learn how to use what you got. Fortunately, I've got stuff like Herman Oak to use, so. Anyway, you can see how the beveling here is working out. I've got about half of this done. I got more beveling to do. I'm going to stay at it here, and I will you'll see this thing come to life here as we do more of this 3-dimension.
What a great place to cut.
That's kind of the thought. I was thinking you were tired of hearing me tell stories.
There's that leatherworkers.net. Every guys will be on there all the time with those Porter saddles, and it's like, hey, can you look up this serial number? Can you look up that serial number? I got this.
Yeah,
it's so funny the different places you can even look where the serial numbers were put in different places.
Yeah, it's some of those saddles from Porter's and some of these old saddle shops are collectibles now, and they didn't have the tools to work with that we have. They didn't have the leather to work with that we have. They have, they just didn't have all of those things, but they still produce stuff that.
Carry on.
All right, I'm almost done here. I got a little bit more beveling to do, and just wanted to answer a question that probably some of you have, too. If you're looking at this closely, you'll notice that my piece of leather has actually got some cardboard or something like that on the back of it, and you're probably saying, now, why in the world is he doing that? Well, the reason I put a backing on my leather, well, there's two reasons you do. One is that leather will stretch. If you're getting a lot of depth out of your carving, if you're really like stamping it deep and getting all of the depth that a piece of leather will give you, sometimes that means that the leather kind of squishes out this way, and it will change on you if you're not careful. So how do you keep that from happening? Well, over the years, many different things. There are people that will apply tape to the back of their leather. And in fact, when I do that, I use this blue painter's tape here. That works really well to do that. And it comes back off just fine. But I've got some cardboard on the back there, and that's what I prefer to use. And why do I prefer to use cardboard? Well, believe it or not, it actually helps me get more depth out of my leather. I can get more depth out of this piece of leather than I would normally. And it's really more telling even on lighter weight stuff. In fact, I've got a sample here within reach. This is some Arizona style carving here that I did once. And this was done on some 3/4 ounce about a 3/4 ounce piece of leather. It's pretty lightweight stuff. And so I had it glued down to this same kind of mat board. And mat board, what that is, it's the same stuff that a picture framer uses to put around a picture and so forth. But let me show you what happens. And I don't know how well that picks up.
Maybe just see if it lays flat and see if it'll just grab shadows.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I don't know, that doesn't, but where am I at? Somewheres.
You're on that other one over there. It's kind of hard we can see it a little bit.
Okay, there you can see it a little bit. But if I tip it up, there we go. See, look at that. Can you see how much that design came through on that piece of leather? Or on that piece of cardboard? Look at that. I actually carved, and if you were to rub your hand over the back of it, well, you can see the design really well on the back of this piece of leather. If you rub your hand over it, you can actually feel that piece of that design is actually pressed in deeper than the leather's thick. Okay, so I actually, on something like this, I actually can get more depth out of that piece of leather than you would ever be able to get without it being down to a piece of leather. It does both. It keeps it from stretching out of shape. But it does also help you get more depth out of it. Sometimes folks are concerned about, well, doesn't that... Yeah, and what I do is I stick that down with some rubber cement so that so that I can peel it back off again. And sometimes, that obviously that leaves it's sticky on the back. So what do you do about that? Well, if you don't want sticky on the back, and a lot of times, like on a wall or something like that, you're going to put a liner, so it's not a big deal. If you're doing just something, a picture or whatever, that's not a big deal there either. But if that's an issue, you can do a couple things. You can, what I did with that piece so that it would come back off is I took a leather finish. It really doesn't matter what kind, but some kind of a leather finish. And I sealed the cardboard first before I put the glue on there. And that kind of helped it come off a little bit easier. the other thing you can do is you can go ahead and actually tape the back of your leather first, and then glue that down to your, with rubber cement down to your cardboard, and then when you get ready to peel it off, well, you can just peel that tape off of the back, and now you got that kind of a backing on it. But again, the reason for that is to get additional depth as well as to prevent the leather stretch. So that's the why of it. So anyway, I'm zeroed in here on the very last cuts. I got all that beveled, and you know what? There's one more little bit of beveling that I want to do, and I want to show you what that is with a different beveler. Okay, when I have a bud like this, and I have like petals coming out from under it, I like to make it look like these two things meet together a little bit. So here, since I used a lined pear shader this direction, I'm going to use one of the other tools I use in the Sheridan style stuff. It's called a center shader. It actually looks a lot like their thumbprints. It's, you know, it's a long skinny tool, and it's got vertical lines on it, but one end of it is kind of squared off. In fact, it's actually even a little bit rounded. And I'm going to use this tool, and I'm going to walk it around right underneath this bevel so that I don't have a sharp chiseled edge here running up onto those petals. I want to have a much more gradual looking transition there. So I'm doing, it's beveling, shading, whatever you want to call it. They call it a center shader, but it's really more of a beveling type step, and that's what I use there. On the other side of that, though, because I want that to meet, I'm going to actually bevel that as well on the opposite side. I already beveled around on one side, but I'm going to bevel the other side just a little bit to create the idea that this rounds off. This is some of that I was telling you about, you know, the beyond the basic stuff. These are the little things. I mean, if I didn't tell you I was doing that, I didn't show you I was doing that, you'd probably look at it and say, man, that's really cool, and never realize that something extra was done to make that happen. And so that's one of the things that I would show you. And just another, I guess, just me being anal, but sometimes when I do really crisp beveling like this, I've got this halo now reaching out onto my petals, and I don't want that so much. So I'm going to take and I'm going to reshade that so that it kind of softens that halo. I've got another trick I'm going to use here later, and I'll show you that. But I'm just going to soften that halo that was created by so that those petals look like they're definitely back in behind that. So anyway, with that, we've got it beveled. So at this point, your beveling should have drawn your eye. It should be adding to the flow of your design, okay? So when somebody looks at this, I want the eye to just kind of follow this whole graceful run of this. And what causes that is good, clean beveling, tapering it out as it gets to the end of these cuts and so forth out here, so that your eye just follows that whole flow. So now we need to put a little more texture on there, and we've got a couple of things that I want to do. One is we got these scrolls, and this is really an important thing to get right. And again, this is, for whatever reason, one of those things some folks struggle with. With the veining that's done on these scrolls, it's done a little bit differently, or at least the way I do it, is done a little bit differently than the way I would on a traditional scroll, the ones that come to a really tight knot in the center. And what's different about this is when I run a veiner on the outside edge of these, and I'm going to run a veiner on the outside edge of these, I'll start down at the narrow end of it, and I'll work up to the fat end of it, and I'll work with the veining. With your veiners have teeth along the bottom edge. If you're not familiar with a veiner, a classic veiner would be would look like this. I'm going to use a special one for this, but here's a classic veiner, and this one here, you can see it's got teeth along the bottom edge of it, and it's got some lines that roll off the back of it. That's a traditional veiner. And when I use the veiner on a regular scroll, I'm going to use it with the teeth pointing down. But when I use the do it on these Sheridan type scrolls, I actually run the veiner upside down from that. I run it with the teeth pointing up, and instead of starting at the bottom and working my way up to the tip, I'm going to start at the tip and work down from there. So because of that, I'm using a different veiner than that traditional one you saw there. This one here is one that is made a little bit differently than I guess a lot of the standard ones. The veiners, and this is kind of typical of what you would get for the Sheridan style stuff. It's a little sharper, and by that I mean it's got a nicer curve, it's got a little tighter curve to it, but it's also sharper in that the backside of it rolls off really sharp. It doesn't flatten out so much leather. It leaves a much more distinct, crisp edge there. And so when I'm using this tool, let's start with this big one right here. When I'm using this tool, I'm going to start out here at the tip. I'm going to tip the tool or angle the tool just a little bit so that it makes a deep impression on the outside edge of that scroll. In fact, I make sure that it's as deep as that line was beveled. So, yeah. But then I have it angled such so that the impression fades out before it reaches very far across there. In fact, I mentioned to you that there's the way I did that shading around there served a purpose. And the purpose is that this helps me to make sure that all of these veining impressions fade out and disappear at the same place. They all come to an end right at that edge that I so carefully didn't, when I kept that nice even distance away from the edge. So this is how I work. I start at the tip and I work my way around there. And because this has a gradual curve, the angle on these needs to also have a little bit of a change in the direction with every impression that you make. I don't have them actually coming straight off of that edge at a 90-degree angle. I have them sort of kind of angling downward a little bit. Again, why? I want your eye to follow the flow of that thing. I don't want it to be look like it was chopped off there. So they are angling downward. The other thing about running a veiner tool on this, or really anywhere you use one, is consistency. Consistency of spacing, consistency of angle. So once you start up there at the tip and you put those first couple in there, that's really the kind of spacing that you want to try to maintain. As I get down here toward where that line ended, I faded it out. You notice I pretty bold, pretty crisp all the way around the top, but as I get down here toward where those impressions ended, or where that line ended that we beveled, it faded out as well. These faded out as well. So what's the result? It looks, look at the flow of that. I mean, the angle of the veining tool draws your eye all the way around down the length of it. That's what we're doing. All the way through this project, I'm thinking about the flow of the design that I'm working on. I'm not just like hammering this in because here's where it's got to go and I'm going to whack it in there no matter what. No, I want to be conscious of the flow of the design. I want it to add grace and contour to this as I go. So make sure that you're not just doing this because, okay, well, I got to whack something in here on the edge of these scrolls. No, what's the point of this? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the end result you want to have? One of the things that makes leatherworking get easier the more you do it is the more you do it, you know what the results are you're trying to create. And as you get I actually have a picture in my head. Yeah, I have the picture over here what it should look like, and that's what you work with when you don't know what you're doing the first time. But I actually have a picture in my head of what I'm trying to create when I'm doing any of this work. I kind of envision it ahead of time. I think that's something you need to strive to do. And you know how you get there? You got to do leather work. You got to actually do some leather work. You got to do more of it. The way you get better with any of these tools is you got to do it. You can watch all the videos you want, but understanding all the little stuff I'm showing you about moisture content and controlling the knife and all of these different things that I've been kind of going on and on about here, all of that, none of that becomes your knowledge until you put it to use. So you got to kind of make sure you are aware of the tools you got in your hand. Obviously, this tool here, because it is fairly sharp, I'm not whacking this as hard as as I did the beveler to get the depth. I mean, it bites pretty quick, so make sure you don't like go into automatic whack-it mode and just start hammering impressions in there. There's got to have a nice, some softness with these tools too. And that, again, that just comes. One of the things that I think, and I'm still very guilty of this, somebody will show me some leather work that they've done, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to study it. I'm going to look at how they used the tools. I'm going to look at the effects they created. I'm going to try to figure out what tools they used and how they used them and so forth. And I still go to school on every piece of leather work I get to look at. I try to understand what they did. And if there's something that's really pleasing about it, there's something that, man, I really like that design and it really, really's got a sweet flow to it. Well, look at it closely. What is it that's catching your eye? What is it that you really appreciate about that piece? And is that something you can add to what you're doing? And that's kind of what we need to do as leatherworkers. We need to keep growing. I was telling you earlier about, how some of the early guys had to build their own tools and they had to make do with whatever leather they have. I had a chance once to get interviewed by a television station. They came out to my shop there. It was Good Morning Texas, and anyway, they'd heard about me, and I'd done some leather work that got some recognition. Anyway, they come out to meet me and to look at my shop and such, and they were just looking at the some of these three-dimensional pieces and stuff like that, and they said, "Oh my gosh, you must be the greatest thing that ever came along." And I told them, I said, no, I said, far from it. I said, I'm a student of everything that's come before me. And, the fact that we're doing some really respectable leather work today has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the growth of this craft. And this craft has grown so much over the years because, honestly, I think the best leather work that's ever been done in the history of this craft is being done today. And I'll tell you more about why I think that, but I want to show you what the tool is that I'm going to go to next. The next tool I'm going to use here is another Vayner tool. This one here, I used to call these shells back when I was learning to do leather work. When you had a Vayner tool that had no teeth along the bottom edge, we called that a shell. And that I'm going to use that not so much as a Vayner tool. I'm going to use it more like a stop. Sometimes on these kind of designs like this where we have a nice slender look, putting a big old teardrop shaped stop in there just wouldn't be quite right. So like where these two petals on this bud here, this cup overlap, I want to kind of define where the end of that line is, and so I use the corner of this tool to do that. I'm just using the very corner of it, have it tipped up pretty sharp to create that. Another place that it can get used is like here where you have these two petals overlapping right here. That's just a good place. And when you have a pattern like this, it's pretty important that when you on the other side, you do the same thing on the other element that's just like it on the other side. And why do we do that? It kind of gives that kind of flared opening to the end of the that, and that's also often where we will use a mule's foot to create kind of a staggered ending to that. And where's my mule's foot? Here we go. A mule's foot. What's a mule's foot? Well, it looks like a letter U. In fact, one of the leather companies, Craftoil, used to mark all of their mule's foots with a U as the prefix on it. But a mule's foot is looks like a hoof print when you stamp it, and it's usually used like along the bottom, right underneath one of these places where we use that Vayner as a stop, and it's usually used in a series of impressions. And so you start out with one that's fairly deep, right up close to that stop, and then you put a series of them following that. Again, follow the flow of the design. So over here where this curve comes around, you notice that the mule's foots kind of follow that curve there, and they get lighter and lighter and lighter. It looks like I had about I stamped 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. I put 7 impressions there, and it looks like I had 7 different size mule's foots, but they were all accomplished by just changing the force with which I hit that tool. So for whatever reason, this was a difficult tool for me to learn to control. I just, part of it is I'm holding it upside down, okay? I'm looking in here at this tool from the inside of the imprint, okay? So that way when I move it down to the next impression, I can see how far away I am from the last one that I just made. Just, you know, making them follow the flow of the design is just really important. So anyway, that's one of the places mule's foot can be used. I'll put a couple here underneath this one as well. There's not room to do quite so many, but still a good way to draw some attention to that. So again, why do I stagger them out like that? Well, I don't want your eye to come to an abrupt halt there, right? I want your eye to follow the flow of that design, and that's what I've been working at here. So there's one other thing that I will do at this point. This is a Jim Linnell thing. This is not necessarily traditional Sheridan, but it's something I like to do. And that is, I'll take a hair blade to my leather. A hair blade? Yeah, I'm going to use a hair blade. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to run it over the long flowing stems here. I've done a pretty good job. I got some good depth here on my beveling. I've got nice square corners here where I beveled as deep as the lines were cut. But, you know, I'd like to soften that. I'd like to have a much softer, more rounded look to it. So I'm going to take this tool and I'm going to, first of all, lean it kind of over the edge so that it runs over that edge just a little bit and it leaves a really fine line. I'm not putting hardly any pressure on this tool, but I'm letting it lay over the edge of that, the outline, and it does two things. It puts a texture on there and it softens that edge. So why would I want texture on there? Well, again, that goes back to that finishing technique that I like to use. I like to use that resist technique where we put a sealer on there and use an antique over the top. And you know what happens? That antique will collect in these little fine lines, and it will add some additional color to my carving. So this is another one of those little beyond the basics kind of tricks, okay? This is one of those things that I show folks that I do, and if I didn't tell you I was doing it, if I didn't even point it out in a finished thing, you might not even notice it. But you know what? It's just one of them things I do, and I really don't have any secrets. That's what I was telling those folks that did that interview of me. They looked around and they said, "We heard leatherwork's a dying art. It's sure good to see that it isn't." And boy, you want to light me up. Just ask me that question. Leatherwork is far from a dying art. And as I mentioned to them, and as I will tell you, it's the best leatherwork that has ever been done is being done today. And there's absolutely no reason that shouldn't be true. You know why? Because, well, today we've got better tools than we've ever had before. We have better leather than we've ever had before. And on top of that, we don't even have to relearn the basics. We've got guys that came before us, Al Stolman, Ken Griffin, Ray Poya, so many, Don King, all these guys, they left a legacy for us to follow. They left examples for us to show us what we can do. We don't even have to rethink it. We can take what they've already shared and left behind, and we can add to it. We can add our own leatherworking skills to that and build upon it. So why in the world wouldn't the best leatherwork that's ever been done be happening today? You know what? What will they say when I'm not around? Who will be taking leatherwork to the next level when old guys like me aren't around to share what we're doing? Who watching the video today will be picking this up and say, you know what? I need to teach this. I need to share this with somebody. I need to show people what I just learned. If you want to take that as a personal challenge, please do. We are all products. I'm a product of all the leather work that I've seen and done. When I sit down and draw a design, it can be a little hard to put what I'm doing into a category. It's hard to say, okay, that's Sheridan style, or that's Porter style, or California, or Northwest, or what, I don't fit into one of those baskets. And you know why? Because I've studied all of these things and worked all of those into my leatherworking. And so when I sit down and draw, when I use elements from all the above, and it looks like I've come up with my own thing. But I haven't. There isn't anything I do that's really, truly original. And anybody that's honest will say the same thing. There's people out there always thinking they got to come up with something new and different that's never been done before, but golly, just take what you've learned and add to it. Add your knowledge to it. All right. So, little things like this, why do you do those if nobody's going to notice it? Because I notice it. I do leatherwork to please me. I do leatherwork because I really enjoy doing leatherwork. I want it to look as good as I want it to be. So, see, one more thing, couple things here I missed. And if you're like me, you probably have done this before too. You probably missed something that you were going to do. Like, I want to go back in here and add a little more depth inside of this this bud here. And so I'm going to take a pear shader here, and I'm going to add some more lines so that I get rid of that halo. I want it to look a little more hollow right in there. So by using the pear shader to mash that down a little bit, I can create a little more hollow. And I saw a line I forgot to bevel. Did you all catch that? Those of you that are watching intently, did you catch that? It's right over here. I missed that line right there. I'd like to tell you that's the first time I've ever done that, but that'd be not being truthful, because I mean, I've been down to like dyeing, putting inlay dyeing into all the background areas, then realize that, oh shoot, I didn't even background that spot. You just get in a hurry, if you're not careful. Pay attention to what you're doing. Just add a little bit of texture on that thing there. All right. So what's next? Well, obviously we got to put some cuts in there, but we got to do some backgrounding. And here we go. Here's another one of those unique, well, not unique, but it's something that's very widely seen in the Sheridan style work is they do things with bar grounders. What's a bar grounder? A bar grounder is a tool used to mash down or put a texture into the background areas. All the openings, the gaps in between are designed here. And the tool itself is a row of very small seeds. And they come in sizes. I've got a set here again from Barry King. There's this one is 7, and this one's 5, and this one's 3. I've got 3 different, and that refers to the number of seeds. And they make them in different size. They have some bigger ones and finer than these, and I don't know which one's best. It kind of depends on what size work you're going to do, but how are they used is really what I want to show you. The way they're used, and this is one of the things, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a beginner to start out with these tools for a background tool, because you got to be precise with them, or more precise than you have to with that matting style backgrounder that most people start out with. With a bar grounder, your task is to lay these in here with row after row, perfectly lined up, side by side, not chewing each other up, and filling these areas in, matting it down. And that's why it's important to background that or bevel those areas down as deep as you want, because now all I got to do is bring this area in the middle down to the same level as how I backgrounded it. And this is also why you need different sizes of these. It's hard to do this whole thing with just one size, because it ain't going to fit into every little nook and cranny. and you want to try to put them in there with some kind of sense of order. I know people that use this tool regularly. This is like the only thing they use, and they are very proficient at it. I mean, they can go bam, bam, bam. They can do this like a jackhammer. They really can rock through doing the bar grounding. And you know what? I can't. I got to be really deliberate with each one, because you don't get a chance to do it over. If you don't get these, perfectly lined up every time and perfectly spaced apart, it's hard to go back and fix that when, with the matting type of backgrounders, the A104, especially for a beginner, if you didn't get that just perfect the first time, well, you can go back and go over it again and clean that up. So why do people use this? That's what you're asking, right? So why would people use these? Well, some of that is tradition. These type of tools are what was used in the the Sheridan style work for sure. It also, though, was in the Porter style work as well. There's other tooling traditions that use these same tools, so there's a lot of variety of reasons why you might use these. One of the reasons probably that it's not my favorite is that it's really hard to get them like perfect. I've seen, I've got a belt done by Don King. I've got leatherwork done by some of the best leather Sheridan style guys out there, and they're not as clean as I like to have my leatherwork. I just don't. I'm maybe too anal. I don't know. So that's my 2 cents, and they take a little more time because you've got to be very deliberate with each impression. So. One of the things about running a bar grounder that I know is that there's a point at which your leather has to be just right for moisture content. So what is just right? Just right is having it probably a little bit drier than some of the rest of your steps that you went through, and that's important. You also have to have a good bar grounder. A good bar grounder that leaves crisp, sharp impressions that are the little seeds that are left behind need to be rounded. They need to not be flat on top, and so they need to be domed, so they have to be built right. And these to not stick. I've had some bar grounders in the past that the leather would want to stick in them, and that'll infuriate you. In fact, I heard if you have some of those bar grounders like that where that sticks, I heard Don King once explain to somebody how you fix that. He said, if you got a bar grounder that is sticking it or leather sticking in it when you use it, take one of those round toothpicks, put it in a Dremel, and then run it and get some rouge on that tip. And then just take that and get inside of your your little seeds and polish them up. He said that'll cure that. So if you got one of those and that's a problem you're having with it, you might give that a try. The ones, like I said, that I'm using are berries. I remember talking to him once about when he was learning to build these. He said, these were painful. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you get the wall of those too thin, you ruin them, and you can't, there's no way to fix that. So you can either make that a 3-hole or a smaller one, if you do it out toward the end. But more than likely, he said, you're gonna probably just have to start over. He said they don't always come out right. I think that was Barry that told me that. Yeah, there's a lot of other folks that have made these over the years. And again, a lot of the early guys, when they were doing leather work, they probably had to build their own tools. Theirs were maybe not quite as polished as what some of what you can get today are.
We're going to hit pause.
Go ahead. So I'm pretty much done with my backgrounding here. There's a couple things you can do. Make sure you're into each of these little tight corners as best you can. So sometimes I'll come back and retouch those just to make sure they're as clean as I can. If you are like me and once in a while get carried away and you have a little ding that goes outside, and that happens once in a while too. Paying attention to one end of the tool and not the other, and you leave a little bite into the edge of a stem or something like that. One of the other reasons I like to use this hair blade to kind of camouflage that, clean that up a little bit. It helps with that. So anyway, this is pretty well done. You can see one of the things I will say about the bar grounding is look at the contrast, the color contrast. Look at how much the design itself stands out. And that's bar grounding. If you've got your moisture content just right, it will burnish real nice. It'll give you some bold contrast in the color here, and that's really an important thing. I want to show you that now because I got to wet it down again. I'm going to do my decorative cuts now. That's kind of the last thing that we have to do here. Well, no. Well, yeah, it is. I'm going to do something else too, but hey, bear with me. Got to dampen it down. We got to have moisture content's got to be a little bit wetter for doing decorative cuts. So I'm going to let that dry for just a minute, and then I will have to put my name on here somewheres, and some of the pieces, in fact, if you look at this one here, the one we used for a sample, you notice that my name is in a little oval there, so let me show you how I do that. Well, we first draw an oval, right? Let's get that drawn on here. That almost looks like an oval. Close enough. And then swivel knife. What's the first thing we do when we get ready to do some cutting? Right? Always when you pick it up, your first thing you're going to do is drop it, get it ready to go. And that's a little damper than I want for my decorative cuts, but this will be all right to go ahead and get this little oval cut in here. And what I've done is just put a boundary around which I got to put my name in the middle of that. I'd mentioned to you that I do my signature with a swivel knife as well. And all of that started because I never could afford, when I was first starting out, to buy a maker stamp. So how do you do that? Well, maker stamps are usually kind of an oval like that, and they have whatever inside. So I did an oval and put my name in it. But I used a swivel knife to do that. So let me do a little beveling around that just to make that pop out a little bit. Let's see here. There's the one I'm looking for. So that almost going to be a little challenge, you think? Sign my name in that with a swivel knife. That's pretty tight, isn't it? Yeah, we'll see. I have done it before, so. All right, so there we go. Now, all right, I'm ready for decorative cuts, and let me just talk about what are decorative cuts. Yeah, it's funny. I'll do sometimes when I'm teaching, a class where we're going through all the basics and we've done all the carving. We're already down to this point, and I'll tell folks in the class, I say, all right, time to do those decorative cuts. And there'll be somebody that says, oh yeah, here's where I mess up every time. This is where I always ruin it with my decorative cuts. So, you know what that tells me, though? That tells me that here's somebody that has not practiced enough with their swivel knife so that they know what's going to happen when they start using their swivel knife. I mean, there's no way this knife is going to do something I don't want it to do. I mean, I got it polished up. My leather's getting just about perfect for moisture content, so it's ready to receive those cuts. So why should I be afraid to do them? What are decorative cuts? Decorative cuts should follow the flow of the design. Everything we've done, the veining, if you follow your eye flows around it. The mule's foot followed the flow of the design. The pear shading added a flow to the design. Your beveling faded out, following the flow of the design. So what do you think your cuts ought to do? Maybe they ought to follow the flow of the design? Makes sense. All right, so let's start out here with the easy one. This one here is about as often as you'll ever get to use a straight cut. Most of the time, they're just not straight. When I do a decorative cut, again, I'm already thinking, when I begin this cut right here, I know how long it's going to be. I know where it's going to end up. I know what the length is going to be. And you know what? I'm going to start tapering it out. I'm going to fade out the length of that cut, or the force on that knife, so that it fades out and disappears exactly when I want it to. I mean, I'm not just going to throw my knife at this and say, okay, let's see what happens. No, I got a plan. I know what I'm going to do. I know what kind of cuts I want to have there. I want a nice, long, flowing cut that flows up the middle of that petal. I want it to have a lot of pressure at the beginning down here near where it starts. And then as it goes away from there, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter, and it just follows the curve. It follows that gentle curve of that petal. And that's what decorative cuts should do. And they should look like they should look like they all flow in the same direction. They should look like maybe they would have eventually connected if they went far enough. These here, I'm kind of running from the base out, so they run that way because of the kind of leaf it is. But when I get on these others, I'm going to be really focused on following the flow of that pattern. So, but there's how they begin. And when you have like a leaf like this one here, well, let's see, it's got a nice gentle curve. So I'm going to kind of follow that gentle curve with my knife, all right? Started out, my pear shading was real heavy out here at this end. It faded out to nothing. So did my cut. It started out heavy out there, faded out as I came down, faded to nothing. And then I'm going to just make it follow the contour of that leaf a little bit, put another little arc at the top there, and maybe a couple short ones like this just to make your eye kind of continue following it like that. So let's work around this one here with that same kind of cut in mind. So following the curve of that on the inside, fades out to nothing. Coming around the top edge of it, some pressure at the beginning, fades out, and then it gets a couple of these here to cause your eye to just kind of continue to follow the flow of that. Same, here's another one. These are pretty easy. Once you get the hang of it, there is some similarity to how these work. But man, this is where that swivel thing really is important. I'm not turning my wrist. If you're watching with, I don't know what kind of angle you have right now with the camera, but if you watch my hand, I'm not bending the wrist. I'm rotating the knife between my fingers. I'm not spinning the leather underneath it to make it curve like that. I'm letting the knife do what it was designed to do. It's a swivel knife, so let that swivel help you make those nice curving cuts like that. See how that follows the flow of the design? They add so much. And these petals, why do we even do them? There are people that just leave them off because they just know they're going to mess it up. But why do you put them in there? Why are they important? Well, these leaves, even though they have some contour and some shape and some 3D-ness to them, they are kind of blank. They're empty, you know. And so we use these decorative cuts, again, to add to that flow. If your cuts don't leave your eye flowing through that design, you're not doing them right. Here's a scroll. What do you think they ought to do? You know, they probably should follow the curvature of that scroll. And we got this really neat pear-shaded area here that's just perfect to lay those cuts in. And so we'll do one, and then we'll actually have another pickup right below that. Again, following the curvature of that scroll. And then just making sure that your eye continues to follow. Put a couple more down below it. Decorative cuts, there are a few folks, well, I think all of us, you're going to find that there are some cuts you can do better than others. You're going to find that you can run your knife left to right or right to left a little bit smoother. You have better visibility one direction than the other. They come out better when you do it that way. And you know what? You'll do those more often in your leather work. And when you do, you'll be kind of getting a signature almost in the way you do your cuts. And that's not uncommon. There's some people whose leatherwork I can tell without ever looking at the name on it or anything like that. I can tell who did some leatherwork because of the kind of decorative cuts that they did. And you will too as you practice. You're going to find those things that work better for you, and so that's what you're going to do. I've known several really great leatherworkers. I've known a lot of great leatherworkers. One of the ones that, in particular, was a guy by the name of Billy Wooters. He was out when I met him, he was out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he was well up in his years. He was one of the last active leatherworkers that worked for S.D. Myers when they were in their heyday. S.D. Myers was one of the big saddle shops in Texas. They built, one time they had a contract and built all the gun leather for the Texas Rangers. They had that kind of a history, and they made, they were the place. If you wanted a great saddle that everybody would want to know who made it, well, that's where you had a saddle made, was at S.D. Myers. Anyway, he was one of the last guys that worked there, and he built all of his own tools, and like a few of us leather workers, he was just a little cantankerous. He didn't have any problem sharing his opinion. You might have noticed I don't either. But first time I ever met him, he came in. I was teaching a class at the Tandy Leather Store out there, and he came in and wanted to meet me. And first thing he did is he come in and he picked up my leatherwork, and he studied it, and he looked at, in particular, at the decorative cuts, and then he threw it down on the table and he says, "Yeah, he knows how to run a knife." And you know what? We were instantly friends. He's one of those guys, I could give him a hard time. He'd give me a hard time back, and he never took it personal because there was respect. And you know what? I think it was because he respected the fact that I wasn't intimidated by a swivel knife. That's how, in visiting with others that he had mentored out there, they said, yeah, that's his thing, He judged you by how well, as a leatherwork, he judged you by how well you could run a swivel knife. And I don't do that. I may have a comment on somebody's swivel knife work. I don't judge you by that. But anyway, when I do, I mentioned this blade, the fact that it's, a little thicker than some. And here's where that really comes into play and is really helpful. This particular blade, that's one of the reasons I like it, is because it's a little thicker than what people use today. A lot of folks today think that if I'm going to do some really fine, delicate work, I got to have a really skinny, thin blade that'll, just do infinitely small stuff. And that's just hogwash. It has a lot more to do with your knowledge of how to run this tool and how much experience you have than anything. And so I like this wider, thicker blade because when I bear down to do these decorative cuts, man, my cuts open up really nice and wide and pretty, and that's what they should do. So, you know how you get good at this? Use it. Practice. I doodle on scrap leather a lot. And a lot of times it's to show folks what you can do, but all of that is practice that comes to bear when it's now time for me to do some decorative cuts. It's time for me to add a little finesse to this. But I teach a class. In fact, I'm doing one in a couple of weeks down in Waco, and I haven't checked lately, but it was almost sold out. I think there was 35 people signed up for it or something like that. It's going to be one of the, well, it always is, one of the biggest classes they have there. And the name of the class is Fearless Swivel Knife Use, I think, is what the name of it is. It's really a swivel knife finesse class, but I named it that because of what I was just saying. A lot of folks get intimidated by this tool. They pick up the swivel knife and there's no, it's going to mess up and they're going to ruin their hard work, just as sure as anything. And that is a lack of confidence. And so that's why that name, I come up with that name for that class, because the way you get confidence is you got to use the thing. You got to learn what you can do with it. You got to test yourself. You got to push yourself to use this knife, controlling the curvature, controlling the depth. That's probably one of the things I stress more than anything in there is being able to control the depth. Can you control going from really heavy, like the 1/3 the thickness of your leather, going from that down to a scratch? And can you do that over the course of, say, an inch? And can you do that very gradually so that you're not like getting down to the end and yanking your blade out of it? I've seen people that will do their decorative cuts and they get down the end and they flick their wrist like this at the end, thinking that that's going to give me that nice taper. Well, when I look at it, it looks like you just flicked your wrist at the end. It doesn't look like a nice taper at all. You got to practice. I mean, you gotta have an idea of what you want it to look like, and then you got to work with the tools and figure out how can I make the tool I have do that. To do good decorative cuts, you got to go buy you a ceramic blade. Nope, it wouldn't matter what knife I use. When I teach that class on this, I'll ask somebody who just bought a brand new knife, and sometimes it's somebody that's got like a brand new knife, one that you would go buy as a beginner's set with, and I'll take that and I'll do my workshop with their knife. I mean, I'll do it with the oldest, newest, least finesse tool that you can imagine, to prove the point that it's not the tool. It's the hand running the tool that makes the difference and how much practice that hand has got. So, all right, double checking, since I forgot to bevel one spot once and forgot to do a couple of things. Just need to make sure they're all the leaves have got some cuts in them and they all flow, and I've got a nice flow to my design. I gotta stick my name there yet though, don't I? All right, so how do I do that? Well, I got to have a tracing pattern. I mean, heaven forbid I misspell it, but it's got to fit in here, into this little oval. So it really is my signature that I put in there. I actually do sign the leather with a pencil. That's what this is. And then I gotta cut those lines. Holy smokes. I could have made that smaller, I guess, just to challenge me, but that's pretty small. All right. Y'all zoomed in on this so that if I do this wrong, I'll embarrass myself?
Yeah. The
Okay.
I comes after the J.
Okay, yeah. I should do the J first then?
Yeah.
Okay. Probably not going to bear down and do 1/3 the thickness right now, huh? In fact, one of the general things about detailed leatherwork is that the smaller and more detailed your work becomes, usually the lighter you got to cut. Because if I cut this as deep as I was cutting some of these up here, well, I'd be spreading my leather out and there just wouldn't be any room to put these little scratches in here that I'm putting. So it's really quiet in here, so I imagine everybody that's watching is holding their breath too, right? I did a class one time. It was way back in my early years of, well, teaching. I was working for Tandy Leather, and I got invited to do a class at the University of Montana for the 4-H. And they said, yeah, there'll be, I don't know, a couple dozen folks there. And I said, okay. Well, I walk in, and there was an auditorium, and it was filled with probably about 85 people. And they said, and they had a camera set up, kind of like this kind of deal here, except it was back in those days, it was a big old camera, you know, like you see in the television studios. And they had that set up in front of me, and they said, if it's all right, we're going to record this because there's another 30 people that won't fit into the auditorium in another room, and we're going to just feed it over there. It's the first time I'd ever done something on camera. And oh my gosh, you'd have thought this was like an electric swivel, like it was going like this here, you know. It was just, I was so nervous and scared. And you know what? I got over that.
I think it's what you say with leatherwork. It's the experience
It is
that gets you over the jitters.
You got to do it, you know. And yeah. Hey, look. There it is. You know what? I think that's done. So, for your comparison, here's another one. The big difference between these two is I used a bar grounder here. I used the matting style backgrounder here. Pretty much the rest of it's the same. I made this name a little bit small, but anyway, other than that, they're basically the same pattern. You know, and that's the other thing. As you use whatever tools you have to do your leatherwork, yours is going to have its own flavor. It's going to have its own look because you use the tools you have. You know, you may not have this exact veiner. Well, use the one you got. You may not have this same mule's foot. Well, use whatever you got. You know, I've used just swivel knife cuts underneath there to make your eye follow it. You know, you can do all of those things, but the main thing is to use what you got and figure out what you can do with your leatherworking. But this will dry, and you know, neither of these have finish on them, but you can then do whatever kind of dyeing and finishing tricks you like too. So, but anyway, that's how that's done. I hope you try these hearts. They're fun to do. They're pretty simple to do. They're not very hard. They don't take a lot of time. They make great covers for like I said, for Bible covers or notebooks or things like that, or if you want to make a special gift for someone, that, you know, it says a lot when you do that. So I hope you'll give them a try. And again, you know how you get better at this? You got to do leather work. So I hope you will. So thank you for joining me today.